Hello, everybody. I'm in disguise today with my glasses. We are in the 15th chapter of Isaiah for our Bible study. If you would like our PDF, download it on our website. There's a link in the description. Today, we're going to be talking about another nation that we haven't talked about much, and that is the nation of Moab. Okay, so here we are at our outline, and let's talk about our timeline. When was this particular oracle or prophecy spoken? We don't know the exact date of this one, when Isaiah delivered it to the people, but we do know that the fulfillment of it came 3 years after it was spoken. You don't find out that out in this chapter. You find out in the next chapter, which is a continuation of this oracle. Chapter 16, verse 14 tells us that information. Our important figures for today, we have Isaiah, who is God's prophet, and we have the nation of Moab. Now, these guys were the relatives of the Israelites, actually, through Abraham's nephew Lot, who we read about all the way back in the book of Genesis. Although they were relatives, more often than not, they were actually enemies of the Israelites. They were sometimes subjected to Israelite rule, sometimes just the outright, violent enemies. They inhabited the land that was immediately to the east of the Dead Sea. And before we get to our outline, we have a couple words to define the first one we have seen before, oracle. This is just a divine announcement, a message from God, at least in this context. And then sackcloth in verse 3. This is a very rough and uncomfortable fabric that was worn by people who were publicly mourning. So if you were publicly, devastated about something, you would wear sackcloth as kind of an outward sign of the condition of your heart and your inward emotions. All right, so now we can flip the page, and we are into chapter 15. There's only 9 verses today, and I've got them all under one section, an oracle concerning Moab. The nation of Moab was going to suffer a similar calamity to those that were prophesied to befall Babylon and Assyria and Philistia, like we saw in chapters 13 and 14. This calamity was likely the result of Moab's pride. Isaiah said, quote, "We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence. In his idle boasting he is not right." That actually comes from chapter 16, verse 6. But there's not another reason stated specifically in chapter 15. It's not quite as clear as why punishment was coming on Babylon or Assyria or Philistia. Moab would be laid waste by an enemy in the night. The text seems to suggest that this devastation would come very suddenly. And there would be wailing and crying in the streets. There would be tons and tons of bloodshed. And those who escaped the initial attack would be hunted down, and their blood would fill the rivers. So this isn't a pretty picture for the nation of Moab. Now, this prophecy is kind of unique in that Isaiah, unlike his prophecies about Babylon, Assyria, and Philistia, he expresses some personal sadness about what's going to happen to Moab. You can kind of see that in verse 5, where he talks about the heaviness of his heart over this. And perhaps that's because Moab was their near neighbor and their distant relation, unlike those other nations. It's also maybe possible that Isaiah could have known some Moabites, because Moab wasn't particularly far from Jerusalem and from the land of Judah. And there were people that were partially Moabites within the land of Israel. We know that for a fact because probably one of the most famous Moabites is Ruth, and the King David is a descendant of her, so he was part Moabite. So there's probably a number of people, maybe that Isaiah had connections with, that had some kind of connection back to Moab. All right, so that's our summary of those 9 verses. Let's take a look at an application. Why do we care about any of this is the question I want to ask here. Why do we care about these foreign nations and prophecies that have only kind of an indirect connection to the larger biblical story of what's going on with Israel and Judah? Why should we care what happens to Moab or Philistia? What's the point of these chapters? Well, I think 2 things, and there's more than this, but here's 2 things to think about. First, it shows that God's prophets were speaking into the real historical world. Isaiah wasn't some kind of mythological prophet that's cloistered away in a nation that has no connection to other historical events. A lot of times when you have some kind of legendary figure, his life, the story of his life plays out in this kind of like disconnected world where it doesn't have to fit into the rest of history. It's like, that's not what we're doing here. Isaiah was a very real man, and his prophecies directly spoke to the fates of real nations, and these prophecies can now be verified by modern historians. So that's significant. It shows us that Isaiah is not some kind of, made-up guy, legend of Jewish history. No, he's a real guy, and he prophesied about real people and real historical events. Second, God's work amongst the foreign nations paints a picture of God as the sovereign of the whole world. Although God selected Israel and Judah to be his special people and to work amongst them in a unique way, His power and dominion was not limited to their borders. He's not some kind of regional God. God had plans for all the other nations, and he was shaping them according to those plans and directing them, even outside of what he was doing in Israel. And this kind of informs us of that, and it helps us to understand a little bit more about God and the way that he was leading all the people of the earth through these periods of history. So this is all leading up to the revelation in Acts chapter 10 in the New Testament that God would not only bless the Jews through the Messiah King, this Emmanuel that we've been talking about in Isaiah, but he was going to bless all of the nations of the earth. And he's now leading all of those nations of the earth in his own unique way that we're not always told about, in preparation for the arrival of Emmanuel. So this is just a small picture of what God was doing in those other places. Okay, so that is chapter 15, and we're going to continue on with the oracle about Moab in chapter 16, Lord willing, tomorrow.